Right. Hi, everyone. Um, Hi, I'm Sandil. I'm the CTO at DataNimbus. Welcome to episode 3 of Conversations with Us. With me today is someone I met on LinkedIn and someone that I've met in person right after I met him on LinkedIn. Matt, he's the SVP of product at VGS. Hey, Matt, how are you doing?
Hello, good morning, good evening. How are you?
Doing fantastic. Matt, it's always great to talk to you about payments. I know how passionate you are about it. And I know some of the stuff that we both shared on LinkedIn, and then we looked at it and we're like, this could have been me, and this is what is going
Yeah, that
on.
was cool. That was really cool.
That
Yeah,
was really fun. Yeah. So it was good to catch up with you. I think we met at Money 2020 in Vegas in October,
that's right.
and that was a pretty interesting and intense event. There was a lot of stuff around crypto. There was a lot of stuff around AI. And if you kind of look at it today, um, a week back, I was in Miami and we were looking at what's going on in the world of payments. I was at the NACHA conference. And what is interesting to see is that uh, the whole industry has kind of taken a few steps back and said, let's talk about what are the basics that we need to get right. So I'm very curious to know from your perspective, especially looking at product and you've been around block for a while. What are really the trends that are shaping the way payments are being done in the US, and what do you think is influencing all of this today?
So I think there's a couple different ways we can break this down. One would be looking at the way the banks are thinking about things, and then there's also kind of like the consumer behavior and consumer preferences, and the fintechs are sort of like in between. And so I think you've got some pretty broad themes playing out in the U.S. Looking at just at the scheme level, FedNow came into being over the last year. TCH with real-time payments has been in market for like 7 years, I think, at this point, but not really fully functional until maybe the last few. And so there's a lot of work being done at the kind of infrastructure and bank level to modernize the way things work. And in some cases, in the case of like RTP and FedNow, building net new platforms, which for a very long time, everything that fintech had been doing was just innovating really risk management and user
Yep.
experience improvements on top of
Mhm.
things like ACH or cards.
Yeah.
And so this is
Right.
the first time you see like a big bet being made on not just like innovating around the edges, but
Yep.
building something from scratch. And I would say that most people probably haven't really felt the effects of that, right? If you look at the
Mhm.
consumer, what I can't use RTP as a consumer
Mhm.
in the U.S.
Okay.
I can receive a real-time payment
Mhm.
from a business that chooses to use the rail, um, but I can't initiate a payment on RTP as a consumer. And so this notion of pay by bank largely is still an ACH construct in the
Right.
US.
Right.
Yeah, and you see ACH is, I mean, it works. It does what it's advertised to do, but it has challenges on the speed. So
Yep.
it's still in some cases it's same day settlement,
Yep.
adding new windows, like trying to speed up the movement of money.
Yep.
Um, in many cases, it's most of the volume is still not same day, right? So it's almost all scheduled payments. So
Yep.
I think you're seeing like a lot of new just raw capability being available, and the banks and the fintechs in the middle are really just, I think, sitting here thinking, what can we do with all these capabilities? And they certainly when it comes to pay by bank, they haven't figured it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's been one of the common themes as well when it comes to pay by bank. And you're absolutely right. If you look at the innovation that was done over the years, a lot of focus went into building on top of cards, right? Virtual cards to begin with, plastic-free cards, digital cards. For the first time, we are trying to create a net new payment method. But the feedback, and to be honest, a lot of people were still not fully familiar with what pay by bank, I mean, how it really works. It's not yet kind of percolated to the end customer. It's not yet visible to the end user. And I think that's a sign of general slow adoption. because one of the other things, and this is where I'm going to kind of dive into, there's so much legacy within the banking infrastructure today to just catch up on. One of the interesting stories was, to simplify reconciliation, we need to enrich a payment message with information like an invoice number. And
Hmm.
ISO 20022 obviously supports a much, much better way to enrich data within those messages. But banks are missing deadlines to comply with ISO, and I find that fascinating because it should be easy, but it isn't for many reasons.
And are you seeing that compliance deadline? Which payment rail are you thinking of for
ACH,
ISO 20022
I mean,
compliant? ACH, yeah.
but in general, the whole migration from MT to MX has just taken too much time, and
Hmm.
there's been a lot of pushback on why do we even need to do this. And where I'm coming from is, if you look at Fed now, right? We kind of launched Fed now. There is still a place for ACH. That's not going to go anywhere, even with Fed now being in the mix.
Hmm.
And we've seen that, for instance, in other markets in Asia and India, that even though we launched UPI and real time settlement, real time payment, there still is a place for a same day clearing. But what I'm trying to kind of understand, and maybe you can shed more light on this, is banks have generally been quite slow to adopt to some of these new things in the North American market. What do you think? Is it risk appetite or lack of it, or is it just general two-speed IT? What are your views on that?
Well, I do think in the case of maybe we can have a conversation a little bit here about ISO 20022 and what it's intended to accomplish, and I think some what what could be an opportunity there. Equally, I think there's some skepticism around we've seen this story before, maybe is a little bit of a story that's playing out as
Mhm.
far as like in the US market in particular. So in the US market, there was an X12 standard that
Right.
was being proposed, not just proposed, but was implemented in the 80s, I think it would have been. It's a little
Mhm.
before my time, but I was certainly was very familiar when I began my work at JP Morgan in the early 2000s. There were there was a BAI file specification that was the way that banks communicated with each other,
Right.
or sorry, banks communicated with their clients,
Yeah. That's
related to information that flowed through all the accounts in the US. Um, it was structured, it was functional, it was rigid. It did not have a lot of flexibility, right? And so it was capable of supporting most of what was going on in terms of commerce. Um, but anytime there was a change in business model, or anytime there was a change in the way that trading partners wanted to communicate with each other, it really couldn't handle it.
right.
And X12, which formed specifications around EDI, electronic data interchange, came in and said, well, we're gonna solve all the issues with like limited file formats and custom file formats. We're gonna have a standard, right? And everyone's gonna follow
Right.
the standard, and it's gonna be perfect, right? And so then they implemented the X12 standard within the ACH system, and
Mhm.
and so if you look at the legacy specifications for like how to communicate complex data associated with an ACH payment, it follows X12, which is the 823. Um, I've done many 823 implementations working with clients, and they're very complicated, even with the standard, because the
Right.
standard is designed to support a fairly, I wouldn't say unlimited set of use cases, but like it's intended to be very broad.
Mhm.
And because of that, it's got all kinds of complexity in the spec. So you've got
Right.
required fields, you've got optional fields, you've got conditionally required fields, you've got conditionally optional fields. And so you have to interpret this very cumbersome
Yeah.
mental map before you can start to then, okay, make decisions. And then both the sender and the receiver has to agree on like, I'm going to populate this
This
information
field, yeah.
in this field, and then you're going to get it over there in that field, and then my bank's not going to mess it up in the middle.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of complexity, and as
Yeah.
a result of that, even though in the case of like an ACH we're using so much jargon here. Is this
Yeah.
okay? Is your audience going to appreciate
Yeah,
this?
they're
I
gonna.
don't know.
There'll be a few folks googling on the side trying to figure out what all this is. But for the most
But the
part, yes,
CTX,
they're
yeah.
familiar
So
with it. Yeah.
the CTX, what you're familiar with the
Yeah.
ACH entry class codes, right?
Yeah.
CTX is when a business originates a payment
Yeah.
and then wants to include lots of invoice detail, and so
Yeah.
it can contain about 10,000 records,
Right.
and it's attached to the payment in the form of this addenda,
Yeah.
and if you can manage to implement that,
Yeah.
it's phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Your straight through processing goes through the roof. Sender gets instant recognition on the recipient side that they paid all their invoices. The recipient's like, I don't even have to touch this. It just pops in, I process the
Yeah.
file, and everything is like clean and magical, right?
Yeah.
But it's very rare because of all those complexities. And
Yeah.
so I think there's a group that kind of sees ISO 20022 the same way.
Yeah. There is. And interestingly, the most downloaded document on the NACHA website is the ACH to ISO mapping guide. That is the most downloaded document on the website.
How would one know that? I'm curious. Like that's an interesting stat
That
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 you
that came from NACHA. That came from the president of NACHA.
interesting. And are they do you see Nacha as I mean, I feel like anytime like Nacha just wants to be relevant, right? They want
Yeah,
to be utilized. And so
exactly.
if there's a transition in the industry that's moving from here to here, they want to be like on board, right? So they can kind of like move with the industry.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure that they actually have like a direct point of view on it should be, done like this versus it should be done like that. To me,
yeah.
the idea is like ISO 20022 had been proposed as a global standard, but when you look at all of the different ways that you can implement that standard between trading partners within different industry segments, what you end up with is a file structure that's standard, but the logic is not. And so
That's
I think what we really need is smarter systems. That's
yeah,
like what's interesting about this year's NACHA conference was faster, smarter payments.
yeah,
I think that's really the area that needs more attention. It's
yeah,
not the file, not the bones of the file,
yeah,
but like the brain that
yeah,
understands it, you know?
yeah. Yeah, that's the challenge I faced with ISO 2022 because it has half solved the problem. It has solved the problem of the schema, which is basically,
Mm-hmm.
what's the file format. But every bank has almost its own interpretation that even though this field is optional, in my bank this is mandatory, right? Which kind of
Yes, that's true.
yeah,
Yeah, so the spec may say you don't have to populate
yeah,
this,
but you
but
have to.
my implementation of this format says you do, right? Here's what I think is really fascinating, and I think this just might be one of those, like, I guess comparing a couple different scenarios, right? Like looking at Visa, MasterCard, the card brands who all sort of like over a long period of time coalesced around a different ISO standard, right? The 8583. Um, they have done a very good job of limiting
Yeah,
how it's implemented, right?
yeah,
Because there aren't that many of them. There's
yeah,
there's a very small number of global card networks,
yeah,
and there's a relatively small number of entities that are really even permitted to connect to those networks
yeah,
directly that need
yeah,
to that really need to implement the standard. So I don't
yeah.
know, maybe it's like 20,000
Something
like
like that. Yep, yep,
entities,
yep.
which is a big number, but it's not the number of
It's not every bank in the
banks
world.
and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
corporates.
yeah,
To me, the thing that I find interesting about ISO 20022 is it's like I think it could work really well for bank to bank communication, standardizing communication between banks.
yeah,
I think when you try to like cross the chasm of the sender as a corporate who's going to originate a transaction using ISO 20022 according to a bank's implementation that will then be delivered to another bank, and then they will have a different interpretation of something that leads to like information getting to the corporate on this side, and
yeah,
think that this game of telephone is going to result in the corporate and the corporate understand what they've just said to each other.
yeah,
Like that's asking a lot
yeah. It
of
is.
a file specification.
It is. It is. talking a little bit more about corporate payments, one of the things that I noticed in Nacha as well, and this is almost becoming a debrief for Nacha, right? Two payment geeks geeking out on it. But one of the things I noticed in Nacha was there's this huge focus on making it simpler and easier for corporates to do payments.
Mm.
And a big part of it is integration with ERP systems and all of that. And this is where I found something
Wait,
very
sorry, integration with which
with
systems?
ERP systems that
Oh
generate
yeah, yeah, yeah,
invoices
yeah,
and all of
yeah.
that.
SAP and Oracle and those guys, NetSuite.
Basically
Yep.
automating account receivables and account payables, right? And
Mm.
doing the reconciliation of an invoice, like an account credit against an invoice. The thing that I found fascinating was the banks that I spoke to, including credit unions, are extremely polarized. You either have banks that say, we absolutely do not want to do anything more than being a clearing bank. Give us a file and we'll clear it. We don't want to do any of the smartness. Work
Mm-hmm.
with fintech partners for that. So work with,
Mm. Mm.
Nuvei or Stripe or any of those guys. And you have the other side of the banks that says, we want to compete with fintechs. And you have almost no one in between that want to juggle having a cooperative relationship with the fintechs and a competitive relationship with the same fintech but in different areas. I've seen that in Europe and Asia, but in the US I've seen it kind of very polarized. And one of the things I'm kind of curious to know from you and understand, what is your take on banks wanting to innovate and go head to head with the likes of Stripe versus take a step back and say, let's just get our kitchen in order and give the best experience for folks like Stripe?
That's a big question. So I just want to, before I forget the different layers of that question, because I think there's at least two big topics that you've alluded to in there. One is Stripe, and competing with Stripe in terms of like whether banks are interested in doing that or not. I think
Mhm.
that's a really interesting topic. And the other is more around APAR, like
Right.
business to business, corporate to corporate,
Yeah.
because Stripe doesn't really play in that space very much.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of like two different kind of like flavors, but same basic kind of like theme, you know.
Yeah.
And I actually see. I was posting a lot about this last year. This sort of emerging bank fintech cooperation that I saw some signs of. It was a very call it forced reality probably
Yeah.
that was being imposed on the fact that there was just a capital contraction in the fintech, especially VC funded fintech world last
Yep.
year,
Yep.
which just continued. And so fintechs have had to become more flexible around like how they go to market. And you've seen in certain instances like with was it Unit, I think, and Treasury Prime are two good examples of like banking as a service platforms that were previously competing with banks for corporate clients as like they wanted to integrate their capabilities into these business solutions, have pivoted and now they are selling to banks. And so I don't know how successful they've been so far, but that they've seen enough around the market at least to say like, we're going to take a strategic decision to embed our capabilities within a bank versus try to compete with those banks to then sell to corporates.
Right.
Um, I think KeyBank is a really good example of a financial institution they've been leaning in on fintech partnerships for more than at least 10 years. And so what they recognized is they're a pretty strong commercial bank, but they're not going to have the tech budgets to compete with the very biggest commercial banks like
Right.
JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
And so they made a strategic decision, yeah, like I said, about 10 years ago to say like, we still want to have innovative products, but we're not going to build them. We're going to have a customer experience. We're going to focus on what we do well, which is manage relationships and manage underwriting and credit risk.
Yeah.
And then we're going to tie up with what we see as the solution providers that have the best capabilities to meet our clients. One of which is partnership they announced is a company called Avid Exchange, and then Avid Exchange is all about accounts receivable automation. So I think you see in their kind of like, I don't know, 20th maybe size US bank, maybe a little bit better than that. 15, something in that range.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big bank, and they're kind of like they're leaning in on partnerships. Then you hear Jamie Dimon talk about, who's the CEO of JP Morgan. He's been very clear that fintech is coming for the banks, right, for a very long time, and he treats it as a kind of like head to head. But even they have formed partnerships with companies like Bill.com. And it's not, they've acquired WePay, right, as an example. And so I think you just see it's not black and white, right? It's like I see at least examples of competition and examples of partnership, and then also you look at like to the Stripe part of the question. Look at Spring by Citi. So Spring by Citi is very much intended to be competing with at least the card processing aspect of what Stripe does. Stripe by bank, effectively, right? And it's still very new. It's getting off the ground. Time will tell, like how well that strategy plays out. But you could see that they believe that the corporate clients want a Stripe-like experience, which previously, if you wanted to do payments as a corporate, you're dealing with big flat files, and it's not very developer friendly. And so I think you're seeing in that case, Citi is saying, like, they're not able to compete as well with those other banks that I mentioned either in the US. And so they're looking for is a niche, saying, okay, we have a great global franchise. We're not as strong as like those top 3 banks in the US. There's a pretty big gap in between. What can we do about that, right? And then so one of the bets that they're making is, well, we can innovate around customer experience on card and real-time payments.
That's interesting. And you mentioned card, and you still haven't kind of forgotten cards, right? And it's interesting that it seems to me that cards have taken a backseat with stuff like pay by bank happening, but cards are in the heart of everything that we're doing. At least card companies are. So JP Morgan, which launched pay by bank, actually launched it with a partnership with MasterCard. And interestingly, MasterCard had the biggest bank as a service or open banking booth at the NACHA conference. Visa acquired, I think, a core banking company recently.
Pismo.
Pismo. So there is evidence that the card companies are starting to kind of play a bigger role in the banking ecosystem.
Yeah, and there's another example of also how intertwined they all are. Pismo's one of their biggest wins was Citi. And so like powering Citi's global DDA platform on the Pismo backbone. Now Visa will be playing a role there. As most people know, if you're following card stuff closely, like Citi is a MasterCard shop, right? And now because of acquisition, they're partnering with Visa through Pismo. And then JP Morgan is a Visa shop. And then, and so what you're just seeing alliances kind of like come and they try things out. And really what they're doing in my mind is they're just saying, like, I want the best of breed. I want to have whoever's got the best tech, I want to have the option to deploy it, right? And some of these like old commercial models, they're being at least questioned, even if substantively they're still really the guard, like that's what's guiding most of what happens. Like, Visa is still the issuer for Chase, for retail cards. And so I think pay by bank is one that it's like, I guess I'd like to maybe put this question back to you. Like, when you think of pay by bank, do you have a clear notion of kind of like what it is exactly that defines when a particular transaction would be a pay by bank transaction? Like, what are the kind of like guardrails that you think of that say like, this is or isn't pay by bank?
I mean, I honestly, I think most transactions fit into pay by bank automatically. The way where I see pay by bank really competing with cards is in the very high value transactions. So stuff like M&A and investments and those kind of transactions, which traditionally would be ACH, pure ACH or wire. I think pay by bank offers a better experience for large corporates, government organizations, credit unions, large lenders to to basically automate some of the larger payments that you
Mm-hmm.
simply can't do or won't do on a credit card instrument. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it was pretty smart of MasterCard to look at, say, hang on a second. I think with what's going on with the rates, the credit card business potentially could be could be at risk. But more importantly, the larger transactions where we don't play a role, can we offer a capability that'll kind of launch that? And tying up with JPMC for that, I think what that was a smart move. It
Definitely.
it's disguised as a new market, but clearly it's going to compete with cards. And I don't know what your take on it is. I'm very curious to know, what do you think Pay by Bank will do to credit card payments in the future?
Yeah, I think I've written about this fairly extensively. So you can always look at some of the details that I've published on the topic. But I would just say that the biggest in card markets, Pay by Bank has had a really hard time changing behavior. So even in Europe, where Pay by Bank has been in place for quite some time, I think it's helpful to just like clarify when we talk about, when I think about Pay by Bank, what I'm referring to is that I think of it as a consumer purchasing capability where I can make a payment to a merchant. I control the initiation of the payment, and the merchant receives that payment
Yeah,
based on my instruction. And so it's effectively like I'm providing instructions to send money, push money, not
yeah,
um, because merchants having permission to debit my account
yeah,
as like a traditional like ACH debit,
yeah,
like that's been in place for 20
yeah.
years, right?
But
Like
that's
that's not new.
yeah, yeah.
That's just ACH
There is
debit.
an inherent risk with that, wherein it's completely trust based today, where you have a mandate, but the in the payment rails,
Yeah,
there's no guard in the payment rails to prevent a debit for a mandate that does not exist, or a mandate that's deactivated, because there's no central repository of the mandates that you can kind of validate against. So it's completely trust based, and the consumer rights basically allow you to kind of operate in that trust based model, because you can always reverse a transaction and say, hang on a second, I'm going to dispute it. But in the Asian markets, there's a need to digitally give consent and record that consent in a secure fashion, and then use that consent digitally. And then there are guardrails and limits around it, which is what I found fascinating, because when you do a debit on a customer's account as a merchant, surely there has to be some way to restrict the amount, the frequency with which you do that. And there are those restrictions, but those restrictions are not nuanced for that customer. The customer hasn't given a consent digitally, which is why I think Pay by Bank will shift the problem, and kind of make more corporate customers use Pay by Bank more than run the risk of wrong debits. The first person who has a negative experience with direct debits is going to be the first customer on Pay by Bank,
they
right?
switch. Yeah. So, but if you look at the world through the lens of the consumer, they have credit cards, they have debit cards, they have PayPal, they have buy now pay later. They have all these options, and then you ask them, hey, but wouldn't you rather just like send the money from your bank account? And a
Yeah,
lot of times they sit there and they go, well, no, I already have a profile with like Shopify that's like already stored all my information. It's got my shipping addresses. Like, so you have to overcome friction to be able to then offer them this experience, which you could argue is somewhat better relative to, risk
yeah,
and fraud. But the customer's perception is also colored by the fact that the networks, when it comes to card payments, have the zero liability guarantee.
yeah,
So even if there is like my corporate card, I hardly ever use it. But I was traveling recently, and within 2 days of using the card overseas, I got hit with some very random charge on my card that was not legitimate. And it didn't bother me in the least. Well, partly because it's a corporate card, and it's not my money, but also because I knew that all I needed to do is challenge the transaction, and it wouldn't stick, right? With
Exactly.
ACH, there is a process for challenging and getting a reversal in place. It's not as straightforward. So people who have had experiences with, say, like stolen identity, and that results in their accounts being, compromised, they have a very hard time recovering those funds. Like, it's not as easy as it would be for like doing the same thing with a card initiated transaction. And a
Yeah.
lot of that again comes back to the networks defining the rules.
Yeah.
And this applies not just to file specs, but to chargebacks and like
Operational
who holds the
processes.
risk.
Yeah.
Like, so everyone likes to complain about the card networks, and I get it. They do serve a very important role, which is to just like kind of like police the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And in the US market, there's actually like 5 different major regulators, right? And each of them regulates individual banks.
Yeah.
Banks choose who regulates them.
Yeah.
And so there's not just one entity that kind of like defines, hey, bank, you need to follow this approach to how you manage, fraud. They all have their own approach, right? And so I just think because of the fragmentation that's in the market, it's largely going to be a fintech that comes up with the solution that I think people will start to say, that's really cool. I want
Yeah.
my bank to support that. And then we'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, and to kind of wrap up on all of this, one of the very interesting things at NACHA was a lot of focus on Section 1033, the whole consent.
Oh yeah, 1033. Yeah, we talk about that all the time.
1033, as we call it. It's so hot, and I found that very interesting that the regulator is now forcing the banks and fintechs to work with, to work better together. So quick 1033, the way I see it is it's kind of like a sign in with Google, but a sign in with bank. And it basically says this is gonna give you access, or this is gonna give the application access to this information, your profile pic, your account statement, yada yada yada. Do you want to say yes? You say yes. I think that's how it's gonna manifest eventually. There are precedences globally of having done some of these things. Um, I see that as a big shift away from the regulators not getting involved, between establishing better relationships between the banking world and the fintechs and saying, you guys figure it out. And now it's like, we're going to lay out a framework and we're going to make you guys kind of comply with it. But there was
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
focus on 1033. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that, because it is such a hot topic right now. And every presentation I go to ends up with a Gantt chart of a project manager wearing a hat and talking about the end goal. This is when we're going to get to 1033. So what are your views on that?
Oh man, that's such a great topic. And I think there's where it's really clear is on data sharing. So what you just alluded to is predominantly the focus is on making it, it's like open banking really finally being written down as a set of rules in the US. When it comes to payments, I think I'm expecting there's going to be a chapter 2 of the 1033. Kind of like once you have an open banking infrastructure, similar to like Europe has 2 different ways of thinking about open banking. One is like the account information service provider, the AISP, and those are the ones like TrueLayer or Tink. Plaid has, I think, also some AISP capabilities in Europe. So that just is really like, you want to share your information with a trusted third party, and then they can give it to you in different ways, doing personal financial, apps and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, so the US has had no good framework for governing that those interactions, right? I think that's largely what 1033 addresses, but it sets things up for the next phase, which would be the PISP. So the payment initiation service provider. I think it's initiation.
Yeah.
PISP. Am I right? Okay.
Initiation settlement, initiation service provider. Yeah.
So and then you register as a PISP in the EU, and then you can instruct banks to execute transactions on behalf of customers that you sign up.
That's
So
what we call POBO, pay on behalf of POBO. Yeah.
So that's not really defined yet.
Yeah.
Even in the 1033, there's sort of like there's some capabilities that are alluded to in terms of like, say, account tokenization that could be used to support a POBO or a PISP model. but it isn't as codified. And so I think it's like a phase one is going to be just like getting the data sharing in place and having
Yep.
standards for who can access the information. And then the second piece will be then, okay, who's now allowed to initiate payments on your behalf?
Yeah.
And that largely your bank could be obviously allowed to do that, but then having fintechs, but registered fintechs who are supervised and following a set of rules, right?
Right.
That's really critical, because if you don't have that, then you know, customers are gonna, I think you're gonna have a trust issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, because even if you get the consent and you acquire a statement for the purpose of making a credit risk decision, you got to purge that information and absolutely not persist it and use it theoretically in memory to make a decision and compute it and then get rid of it. If there's even the slightest of an audit log or some trace of it, it's a risk. Because you got consent, but you got consent not to store it and use it. You got consent to make a decision and then move on. So I'm
Yeah,
sure fintechs will come under scrutiny and come under audits, and that will have its own consequences of the speed at which they can operate.
yeah, I'd say what the one so today, right now, if you were to say like, where is pay by bank alive and functioning in the US, it would be through like a company like Trustly. I'm not advertising for Trustly, not endorsing them, just saying they have a model. The company that Trustly, which is a European headquartered, you know, business, they acquired a US company called Pay with My Bank. So it's right there in the name.
There you go.
Um, Even they though are not a push-based solution.
Yep.
They're still, what they have is a process for more easily obtaining the payment credentials needed to debit an account, and then they guarantee the amount. So the
Yeah.
merchant is sort of like, you know, doesn't have the risk of or will there be sufficient funds to cover this? Like Trustly has a model where they do risk assessment of the source of funds. They do some kind of screening of the source of funds, and then they facilitate the movement of those transactions,
Yeah.
which is solving the problem, but it's expensive, right? Like you're having to underwrite, you're having to go get like a credit facility in place.
Yeah.
They're taking on a lot of risk, and for that risk, they're asking for, I think, 1% of the payment value.
Mhm.
And so, yes, is that cheaper than a debit? Sure,
Yeah.
but a real-time payment, just push from account A to account B, is pennies, right? And so
Yeah.
I think we're just still, until we get to push, I just don't see pay by bank
Yeah.
like really being able to take off.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that. Lastly, just before we completely wrap up for the evening, and I know we can talk for hours together on payments, but what do you think is the number one trend that is driving this whole transformation within the US? Because I'm seeing so many banks investing so heavily in technology, which in the past it was all about keeping the lights on, and right now it's all about transformation and compliance, and whether it is subscribing to ISO, new formats, or modernizing infrastructure, building Zell journeys, things like that. What do you think is driving all of this?
Hmm. Well, I think that the cost of compliance when you don't have systems that are designed to manage risk from the bottom
Right.
is very expensive, right? And so a lot of the banks, larger banks especially, had come under consent orders, which, if you're not from the US, is really just it's a regulatory action when a bank's
Mhm.
regulator comes in and says, I see problems and I'm going to very, very closely scrutinize what you're doing and expect that you're going to like respond to and fix these things, right? Often anything that they find, the solution is people, right? Just bodies
Yeah.
and point solutions. And so most of the large banks over the last 10 years have had, and Wells Fargo is still actually operating under multiple consent orders. Um, the banks that were sponsoring fintechs, there's
Hmm.
been multiple regulatory actions on them. We had bank failures last year, right?
Right.
There was significant.
Yep.
And so I think you see the regulators ever since really the '09 kind of
Right.
like, you know, real estate bubble collapsing all the way through now have been taking a stronger and stronger stance in enforcing. Originally, it was capital, and then it was AML,
Yeah.
and then now you're seeing more like consumer protection, right? And so I think most of what's driving this is like banks just want cleaner systems, fewer systems. Like they have so many different like disconnected, business or technology entities within their back office. They're disjointed, and then they don't have visibility. And so things like standardization of file formats and having consistent best practices for risk and compliance. They would have seemed very boring, and nobody would care that much.
Yeah.
Now they become the difference between you're the most efficient bank in the game to the least efficient, because you don't have good technology. And I did work at JP Morgan, so just full disclosure there. Jamie had been talking about investing in compliance as a competitive value add back when we were under a consent order in 2000, whatever it was, 10, 11. Because everyone was complaining, oh, this is crazy, we can't innovate, we can't do anything, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, we like investing in compliance technology will make us more competitive.
Yeah.
And he's not right about everything, but he's right a lot. And this is just one area where you just go look at the latest results for JP Morgan's efficiency ratios compared to their peers. It's not even close.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. That's a very unique take on dealing with compliance and treating it almost as a catalyst for innovation, which it is. You're right.
It's simplicity first and foremost. What the main thing is that he did is it made everything it's simplified, because in order to understand and have visibility of your risk model, you had to have fewer moving pieces, right? They had to be so it isn't a monolithic approach, but it is more of like a standards-based approach. And so all the data flows into the same place. In order for it to get there and be intelligible, it's the easiest way for that to happen is to have fewer sources of data in the first place, right? And so you start just making your whole machine just leaner and cleaner.
Yeah. It's so funny. I'm gonna sign off on this one very funny story. Met someone in the US, and I talked about what a payment hub is, which is basically a central way to receive all payments and clear all payments. And I asked the guy to draw on a list on a small piece of paper every channel that can initiate a payment in today's day and age, every type of payment, and every clearing rail. And well, both of us don't really have a head full of hair, but I can tell you that was a hairball that needed to be completely untangled. And when you talk about simplicity, getting those basics right and getting that single view of what's going on is almost table stakes before you could do a lot of the innovation. So I get what Jamie says. Yeah.
And that's I'll just leave you with this one last example. I won't name the bank, but you might be able to figure it out. There's a very large bank that was focusing historically on just investment banking that wanted to enter into the treasury banking space.
Got it.
And so they had an opportunity to build de novo, right? They didn't have infrastructure before. They built everything in their environment on the ISO 20022 schema, all their data models, everything inside of their infrastructure. It only communicates in ISO 20022. And so I think that'll be a very interesting lab test around does it work, right? Like, does it work technically, but does it work at scale operationally, having all the interfaces to the outside coming in and internally following like a very prescribed standard? It should be very efficient, right? And it should make for just a simpler development experience.
Yeah, and a simpler vocabulary when it comes to troubleshooting a problem or just dealing with BAU, right?
Yeah, you at least share a lexicon. I wouldn't say that the schema is simple vocabulary, but once you know it, once you all speak the same language, I guess it feels simple.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, that was great. Thanks, Matt. It's always fun talking to you.
Yeah, you as well, Sandy. It was awesome. Thank you.
Cool. See you around. Cheers.
All right. Bye.